2 Just Stop Oil protesters have been jailed for throwing cans of soup on Van Gogh's painting of sunflowers. Now, I'm sure you've seen footage of the protest before, but just to jog your memory, this was at the National Gallery in October 2022.
Security! What is worth more, art or life?
The only reason I'm laughing is because that guy who says, security, makes me laugh every single time. But this is, of course, a serious story, especially now. They've been in prison. So the young woman you heard there speaking is called Phoebe Plummer. She's now 23 and has been sentenced to 2 years in prison. Anna Holland, aged 22, received a 20-month sentence for the same offence. In his sentencing remarks, the judge in the case said this: "You two simply had no right to do what you did to sunflowers, and your arrogance in thinking otherwise deserves the strongest condemnation. The pair of you came within the thickness of a pane of glass." Judges are so dramatic. "The pair of you came within the thickness of a pane of glass of irreparably damaging or even destroying this priceless treasure, and that must be reflected in the sentences I pass." It seems like a ridiculous sort of reasoning. You know, the pair of you came within the thickness of a pane of glass. It's like if it had been, it doesn't matter how thick it was, right? They knew that the glass was going to protect the painting. It doesn't. If it was a really thick bit of sponge, then it would have been terrible that they'd done that. The 2 young women responded to the sentence by hugging and blowing kisses to the public gallery before the sentence. So Plummer, so she was the person you heard from in the clip, gave a 20-minute speech in mitigation, which included this passage. "On the 14th of October 2022 and in November 2023, I made the choices to take actions that I knew would likely lead to my arrest and prosecution. I made those choices because I believe that non-violent civil resistance is the best, if not the only tool that people have in order to bring about the rapid change required to protect life from the accelerating climate emergency and the political decisions being made that pour fuel on the flames and which sentence us all to a catastrophic future. Whilst, of course, there are reasons why my life and the lives of people I love and care for would be easier if I don't receive prison sentences today, I don't intend to go into detail about these. My choice today is to accept whatever sentence I receive with a smile, knowing that I have found peace in doing what I can to defend countless millions of innocent people suffering and dying." The severe sentences for both Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland were presumably intended to deter others from taking similar types of direct action, but the early signs don't suggest it worked, as within hours this happened.
People in prison demanding an end to new oil and gas, something which is now government policy. After sustained interruptive actions, countless headlines, and the resulting political pressure, future generations will regard these prisoners of conscience to be on the right side of history.
So that happened, hours after 2 young women were sent to jail for 20 months and 2 years. Of course, they'll probably only serve half of those. The other will be on remand or whatever. One can only presume those protesters are prepared to receive similar prison sentences. Aaron, these do seem like remarkably long sentences. I mean, at the same time, it's clear what the judiciary are doing. They sort of thought, this is happening too much. We need to sort of set a big example and send people to prison with these sort of exemplary sentences. But Just Stop Oil activists are saying, we're still going to do it.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? You saw Hugh Edwards in possession of quite awful material with regards to underage children, minors, being in possession of that, and he didn't get a custodial sentence. I believe he got a suspended sentence, didn't he? And yet you have people like Roger Hallam going to prison for 5 years, one of his quote-unquote co-conspirators going to prison, I think, for 4 years, and now these 2 going to prison. I mean, it's not even criminal damage. I mean, it's just... you're throwing something at a pane of glass, which is literally just wiped off. I mean, it's actually insane. I was expecting a custodial sentence for the reasons you're saying, Michael. I thought they would try and make an example, create a deterrent, but 2 years for literally throwing something which a kitchen towel can wipe off. Really, really something, Michael. when you think there are people out there who they've been released early because of Starmer's early release of prisoners, by the way, and that's not an attack on that policy. There's not enough capacity. I get it. But you look at some of the people who were released and what they were guilty of, and then you've got these young people going to prison for throwing something at a pane of glass. And the argument put forward by the judge is so utterly ludicrous. It's just nonsensical. I mean, I don't even think this is vandalism, personally. I think this is sort of, you might say it's a minor public nuisance or aggravated trespass. They were asked to leave and they refused to, whatever. A couple of years of your life. And I think it really does bring into sharp focus that these are political sentences and this is political sentencing, and hence they are treated far more harshly. But then I've also got a question, Michael, which is this. We have essentially stopped using coal in this country for electricity production. The government did not allow a new coal mine to be used with regards to creating steel. It was coking steel. You need coal in order to produce steel. Not all steel, most steel. And there was a mine which won't be opened. It was refused to be opened by the government. That's not happening. You have HS2 being built. Some people who are Greens didn't want that to be built. You see, like I say, per capita CO2 emissions in this country actually on a global standard, pretty good. So I want to know what the demand is, because in a global context, the UK is actually doing very well. Partly, of course, that's because we outsourced our CO2 emissions to the developing world, like places like China, of course. But compare us to countries like the US, Canada, Australia. I mean, our CO2 emissions are about 50% per head of what theirs are. And actually, I think we're falling more quickly than they are too. No new oil and gas in the North Sea under Labour. We don't have fracking. So that's not to say we do everything right. I think there are many things we should be doing. I think, for instance, we need to ban grouse hunting. I think we need to be giving up large swathes of the English countryside, obviously not good farming land, but we should be giving that over to rewilding, to create carbon sinks, to underscore better biodiversity, things like that. But I want to know what the demands are, because the UK right now has a timeline to decarbonise by 2050. Labour's saying, I think they can get to zero emissions electricity by 2035. That's kind of the plan. We've got to change the government now. And the Tories, for a centre-right party, actually weren't that bad on CO2 emissions. Very bad on other things, of course. So I want to know the demand, because in a global context, the UK is not a bad guy. That's not to say we do everything right. That's not to say we shouldn't protest. I'm not making those stupid reactionary arguments. My point is this, I suppose, Michael. If you're going to go to prison for a couple of years, you need to have a crystal clear demand and a crystal clear politics. And raising awareness about the climate crisis is very good. Very brave, very courageous what these people have done. I commend them and I admire them. But I do also think that people shouldn't be taking going to prison lightly. It will have a massive impact on your life. Massive, massive impact. I wonder what your thoughts are, and also the thoughts of our audience.
I mean, I suppose on basic terms, the demand's on the T-shirt, right? Just stop oil. So they're saying that, yes, it might be the case that the British government isn't the worst in the world. And actually, if you look at our emissions trajectory, even if you do count, those outsourced emissions, we have massively reduced our CO2 emissions. We're not relatively particularly bad when it comes to this. But if you see climate change as the emergency it is, and you say being a bit better than other countries isn't necessarily good enough, and I suppose people argue. I'm personally not somewhat sympathetic to the idea that says sort of what really matters is investing in the kind of technology that you can export to the developing world, because growth needs to happen. We need those countries in the global south to continue growing so that they can live prosperous lifestyles like we have in the West. And we need to make sure that can be done sort of cheaply, because they're not going to forego that. So I'm probably, I imagine, much more interested in sort of investing in tech solutions than the people of Just Stop Oil are. I imagine actually our politics, or my politics and their politics, are quite different. But I do think it's clear the message they're making. And I do think there is a real sort of logic to it. And the way I think about it, I suppose, is I think that actually we are kind of going in the right direction when it comes to climate change. We have lowered our emissions considerably in this country. We are rolling out sort of green energy. The Labour Party have promised to make all electricity green by 2030. That's really ambitious. I suppose where I come from, and I'm somewhat, I don't say this with absolute certainty, but the framework I think about this is, how did we deal with COVID? So when COVID came along, it wasn't that sort of we said, okay, we might think about a lockdown, which we might do sort of over a 20-year period. We'd love to do a bit more testing. We know that scientifically we need more testing and that we need vaccines, but actually we can't really afford it because of our fiscal rules. No, when COVID came along, we recognized it as sort of the societal threat it was, and the usual rules of the game got thrown out the window. And I think that when it comes to climate change, there's a very good argument that we should have precisely the same kind of political response as we did to COVID, because while at the moment I think we're going in the right direction when it comes to climate change, we're not going there nearly quick enough. And if we don't go there quick enough, then there will be lots of catastrophic climate change around the world. I don't think that means that all of our futures will be a disaster, but there will be certain parts of the world where it will be quite disastrous. So I suppose Just Stop Oil is to say, if we're really taking this seriously, if we're really taking this sort of to be an emergency on the scale of COVID, politics as usual has to go out the window. And that means that even if the government, the previous government had signed contracts with oil companies to say they can extract the oil, we do have to, now block those contracts. Obviously, the Labour government saying we don't want to, rewrite contracts written by the previous government because that will sort of upset business confidence. If you see climate change as sort of a COVID-like crisis, then normal politics should go out of the window. And I suppose Just Stop Oil as a slogan, I think speaks to that. I don't know. What do you think, Aaron?
Well, I think that's all correct. And obviously, I agree with you on the existential nature of the climate crisis. But we had about half an hour ago, you were talking about the relative price of industrial energy for the UK versus other G7 economies. We have the most expensive industrial energy in the world. That's because of choices made by successive governments to not focus on fossil fuels. We've moved away from carbon. This country has tons of coal. This country has tons of coal. We have hundreds of years of coal underneath our feet in many parts of this country. We didn't do fracking. These were political choices which are effectively wins for the green movement. And there was a political trade-off about cheap energy and green energy. And green energy has won that argument. So Just Stop Oil, well, we have kind of started to stop oil. I mean, yes, you're going with coal first, but increasingly sources of energy, particularly for electricity in this country, are coming from renewable sources. And Labour's now saying it needs to be nuclear too. So, and that's not a criticism of these people, Michael. I want to be clear. But I think often we have inherited demands, political objectives, which actually don't necessarily make sense. I spoke about grouse moors a moment ago. Why am I talking about grouse moors? You have around 3 million acres in this country given over to grouse moors in Scotland and England. Most of it's in Scotland, about 500,000 acres in England. These should be carbon sinks, but because we basically destroy these habitats for a single species, grouse, red grouse, to be hunted, they don't just not absorb carbon, they emit it. And we kill a ton of biodiversity. So that to me is just such an obvious thing of we need to get this thing banned. But instead the political conversation is we say to white van man, please don't have a car, or please don't take your family holiday this year to Spain. And I don't know. I don't think that's quite right. There is such a huge asymmetry of ownership of resources, consumption of resources in this country. And there are still so many things that I think the public doesn't know about with regards to, like I say, biodiversity, consumption of things like, peat in grouse moors. I don't know. I feel like that's the kind of thing that we should really, really be focusing on. Collapsing biodiversity. And again, like I say, these are very courageous, brave people. All those wins I just talked about, by the way, are because of people like them pushing the debate forward. But sometimes you need to take a step back and think, okay, well, we want this thing. It's really important. It's going to be really hard. What's the most sensible, pragmatic course of action?